The cab ride had been quieter than usual, but the moment Jack and I stepped out onto the bustling city sidewalk, the noise swallowed us whole. Cars honked aggressively in the distance, and the hum of voices blended with the occasional clatter from the nearby restaurants. I held Jack's hand a little tighter as he stumbled to keep up with my pace, his wide eyes darting around as though he were seeing the city for the first time. "Mom, why is it so loud here?" Jack asked, his small voice barely audible over the din. "It's just the city, sweetheart," I replied, tugging him gently toward the entrance of the restaurant. "It's always like this, busy and noisy. But don't worry, we're going inside soon." The neon lights of the restaurant flickered above us as we approached the door. This place was upscale, exactly the kind of place Thomas would choose. He always liked to keep up appearances. I hadn't been back in the city for long, but in that short time, I'd already begun to feel the stark difference between our former suburban life and this chaotic urban environment. The smells of street food mixed with the faint scent of exhaust fumes. It was overwhelming, a far cry from the fresh-cut lawns and quiet mornings I used to enjoy. We stepped inside, and the shift was immediate. The chaos of the street was replaced by soft jazz playing overhead, the clink of wine glasses, and the hushed chatter of the well-dressed patrons. I could feel eyes on me as I walked past tables of couples and business dinners, their glances lingering on my slightly frazzled appearance. I suddenly felt underdressed, out of place. Jack tugged at my arm again, his patience already wearing thin. "When's Daddy coming?" he asked, craning his neck to look around the crowded dining room. "He'll be here soon," I said, trying to sound certain, though I wasn't entirely sure myself. Thomas was always late, always distracted by something or someone else. This meeting had been his idea, but his last-minute plans were starting to feel more like a power play than a genuine attempt to finalize our divorce. We were led to a booth near the back of the restaurant, where the lighting was dimmer, and the air felt heavier with anticipation. The hostess handed me a menu with a polite smile, and I forced myself to return it. Jack slid into the seat next to me, immediately reaching for the crayons and paper the hostess had left for him. I watched as he started drawing a stick figure version of our family, me, him, and his dad, like nothing had changed. "Do you want to order something, Jack? Maybe some fries or chicken tenders?" "No, I'm not hungry," he mumbled, too engrossed in his drawing. I sighed and picked up my own menu, though my mind wasn't on food. The idea of this dinner, this meeting, with Thomas had been gnawing at me ever since he suggested it. We hadn't seen each other face to face in weeks, and every interaction we'd had lately was cold, calculated, just another step towards separating our lives for good. I wasn't sure how I felt about it anymore. Angry, maybe, or just numb. "Hey, Mom, what's that?" Jack's voice broke into my thoughts, and I looked down at where his finger was pointing. Something had fallen out of the menu, an envelope, plain, unassuming, except for the embossed logo in the corner. Thomas's law firm. My heart skipped a beat as I hesitated before picking it up. "What is this?" I whispered, more to myself than to Jack. "You gonna open it?" Jack asked innocently, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Yeah, I guess I should." I tore open the seal carefully, already dreading what might be inside. The papers felt heavy in my hands as I unfolded them, the familiar legal language jumping out at me in waves. But it wasn't until I saw my name that the full weight of it hit me. It was a will, Thomas's will, and he had named me as the sole heir to everything. I blinked, trying to absorb the words on the page. This couldn't be real. Why would Thomas, a man who had been so eager to sever ties with me, leave me everything? "Mom, what's wrong?" Jack's voice sounded distant, muffled, as if I were underwater. I shook my head, forcing a smile. "It's nothing, honey, just some paperwork." I glanced at the clock. Thomas was late, really late now, and with this document in hand, I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of dread. Something wasn't right. As if on cue, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I fished it out quickly, hoping it was Thomas with an explanation, but it was only a text from my lawyer, James. "Have you heard from Thomas yet?" I typed back a quick response, my fingers shaking slightly. "No, not yet, but I just found something odd. We need to talk." I leaned back in the booth, trying to make sense of it all, but the more I thought about it, the more uneasy I felt. Where was Thomas, and why had he left this will for me to find like this? "Mom, is Dad coming or not?" Jack asked, his frustration beginning to show. I looked at him, his innocent face still untouched by the complications of our adult world. I wished I could protect him from all of this, from the uncertainty that was creeping into every part of our lives. "I don't know, Jack," I said softly. "I really don't know." This detailed chapter weaves Melanie's first impressions with Jack's innocent perspective and sets the tone for the mystery that will unfold. The dialogue gives insight into their relationship while also building tension around Thomas's absence. I couldn't take my eyes off the document in front of me. The words blurred as my mind raced to make sense of what I was reading. Sole heir? Thomas had made me the beneficiary of everything, his estate, his assets, everything we had once shared, and more. I leaned forward, the dim lighting of the restaurant casting shadows over the neat rows of text. This wasn't just some paperwork mistake. It was real, legally binding, and totally inexplicable. Thomas had been insistent on moving ahead with the divorce. Our conversations, if you could even call them that, had been clinical and detached. I couldn't remember the last time we spoke about anything other than logistics. The house, the assets, custody arrangements for Jack. Why then would he leave everything to me? The sound of Jack's crayon scratching against the paper brought me back to the present. I quickly folded the will and slipped it back into the envelope. No need to let Jack see my growing anxiety. "Mom, what was in the paper?" Jack asked without looking up, still focused on his drawing. "It's just something your dad left here for me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "When's Dad coming?" he asked again, his brow furrowing. The restaurant had begun to fill up, and the clatter of dishes and voices swirled around us, but Thomas was nowhere in sight. I glanced at my phone again. Still no messages, no calls. The unease in my stomach twisted tighter. "I'm not sure, Jack. He's running late." "Why's he always late?" Jack's tone was tinged with the frustration that only a child can muster, a mix of confusion and impatience. I didn't have an answer for that. Thomas had always been the kind of man who operated on his own time. But this felt different, something more than just his usual disregard for punctuality. Maybe he got stuck at work. I offered weakly, though I didn't believe it myself. It wasn't like Thomas to suggest a meeting and then disappear without a word. Suddenly, a waiter appeared at our table, interrupting my spiraling thoughts. "Ma'am, can I get you something to drink while you wait? Maybe some appetizers for the little one." I glanced at Jack, who was still engrossed in his drawing, oblivious to the growing tension I felt. "Just water for now, thanks," I replied, "and maybe a small plate of fries for him." The waiter nodded and slipped away, leaving me alone with my thoughts again. I pulled out my phone and shot a quick text to Thomas. "Where are you? Jack's waiting." No response. I sighed, rubbing my temple. The noise of the restaurant was starting to get to me, the clinking glasses, the distant laughter of other diners. The normalcy of it all felt out of place against the strange circumstances I found myself in. Jack tugged at my sleeve, pulling me out of my daze. "Mom, look, I finished the picture." I glanced down at the drawing he was proudly showing me. It was simple, just the three of us standing together, smiling. Me, Jack, and Thomas. My heart clenched at the sight of it. He didn't understand that our family had already changed, that things would never be that simple again. "That's great, honey," I said, forcing a smile. "You did a really good job. Can we show Dad when he gets here?" I hesitated. "Yeah, if he gets here soon." Just then, my phone buzzed. I grabbed it quickly, hoping it was Thomas, but it was James, my lawyer. "I'm on my way." Have you heard anything from him yet? I frowned, typing back, no, nothing. But I found his will. He left everything to me. James's response was almost immediate. That's unusual. Let's talk when I get there. I'll see you in a few minutes. My heart raced. I didn't know if it was the shock of the will or the ominous feeling that had been creeping over me since we arrived, but something wasn't adding up. Thomas had never hinted at this, never mentioned anything about changing his will or wanting me to inherit everything. We were in the middle of a divorce, for God's sake. The fries arrived, and Jack dug in happily, but I barely touched mine. I kept glancing at the door, expecting Thomas to walk in, expecting some sort of explanation, some reassurance that all of this was just a misunderstanding. But as the minutes ticked by, that hope faded. Finally, James walked in, his tall frame and serious expression immediately drawing my attention. He spotted me and made his way over to the booth, nodding briefly in greeting before sitting down across from me. "Hey," he said quietly. Still no sign of him? No, I shook my head. And I don't know what to make of this. I slid the envelope across the table to him, my hands trembling slightly. James opened the envelope and began reading the will, his eyes narrowing as he skimmed the document. After a moment, he looked up at me, his face unreadable. "This is highly unusual, Melanie. Why would he leave everything to you when he's been pushing for a clean break?" "I have no idea," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. "It doesn't make any sense. We haven't been on good terms in months." "Has he said anything to you about this? Made any comments that could explain it?" "Nothing," I said. "We've only talked about the divorce. I didn't even know he was updating his will." James sat back, running a hand through his hair. This is a lot to process, especially with him not here to explain. "Have you heard anything from his office? Maybe they can give us some insight." "No, nothing, and his phone goes straight to voicemail." James's face darkened. "That's strange. I don't want to jump to conclusions, but with him not showing up and this sudden discovery, I think we should start asking some questions." "Like what?" "Like where the hell he is," James said bluntly, "and why he left you this without telling anyone." He paused, his gaze softening slightly. "I'm sorry, Melanie. I know this is a lot to take in, especially with Jack here." I nodded, feeling the weight of it all crash down on me. The will, Thomas's absence, the growing sense that something terrible was happening just beyond my reach. "I don't know what to think anymore," I whispered, my voice cracking. "I just want to know what's going on." James leaned forward, his voice calm and steady. "We'll figure this out, but first, we need to find Thomas." This chapter explores Melanie's growing confusion and anxiety, heightened by her unexpected discovery of Thomas's will. The dialogue with Jack and James adds depth to her emotional state while pushing the mystery of Thomas's absence further. As I sat across from James, the weight of the moment settled heavily on my shoulders. The will in my purse, the absence of Thomas, and the gnawing feeling that something was deeply wrong. It all swirled in my mind like a storm I couldn't escape. Jack had finished his fries and was now quietly playing with a toy car, unaware of the tension mounting around us. James leaned back in his seat, eyes scanning the restaurant. "Something doesn't add up, Melanie," he said, his tone serious but calm. "Thomas was never reckless with his affairs. For him to vanish like this, and for you to suddenly be named in his will, it doesn't make sense." I nodded, swallowing hard. He didn't even mention changing his will. I don't understand why he would do this, especially with the divorce happening. James tapped his fingers on the table, thinking. "Has there been any recent change in his behavior? Anything at all that stood out to you?" I hesitated. Thomas and I hadn't been close for months. Our conversations were stilted, transactional, and mostly about Jack. But there had been moments, little things that had seemed off at the time, but I dismissed them. The late-night phone calls he never explained, the mysterious trips that were always business. I had chalked it all up to the strain of our failing marriage, but now in light of the will and his absence, it felt more significant. There were some things, I admitted, choosing my words carefully. He'd been acting distant for a while, more than usual. I thought it was just because of the divorce, but now? James raised an eyebrow. Go on. I glanced at Jack to make sure he wasn't paying attention before I continued. He was taking calls late at night, always stepping out of the room. He was traveling more too, said it was for work, but he never really told me where or why. I didn't think much of it at the time. I figured it was just part of him pulling away. James frowned. That's definitely something to consider. But why leave everything to you? If he was pulling away, if he had someone else, this makes no sense. My chest tightened at the mention of someone else. I knew about Rebecca. Thomas hadn't been discreet about his affair. I had tried to distance myself from it, telling myself that it didn't matter anymore, that I was better off without him. But this, leaving me as the sole heir, was beyond anything I could comprehend. I don't know, I murmured. Maybe it's some kind of twisted guilt, or maybe he wanted to hurt her, Rebecca. James' eyes flickered with something. Sympathy, maybe. He took a sip of his water before speaking again. That's a possibility. But we need to get to the bottom of this, Melanie. You need to protect yourself. Until we find out where Thomas is and what's really going on, this will leave a lot of questions unanswered. I ran a hand through my hair, my mind racing. What should I do? For now, we wait and see if there's any word from him or his office. I can start digging around, see if there's anything unusual going on with his assets or his business dealings. James paused, then leaned in slightly. But Melanie, I need you to be prepared. If something's happened to Thomas, something serious, this could get complicated, legally and emotionally. I didn't know how to respond. The idea of Thomas being hurt or in danger had crossed my mind, but I hadn't let myself dwell on it. Not yet. I wasn't ready to face that reality. At that moment, Jack tugged on my sleeve, breaking the tension between James and me. Mom, can we go home now? I'm tired. I glanced down at him, his wide eyes looking up at me expectantly. In a few minutes, sweetheart, I said, giving him a soft smile. Just a little longer. James stood up, pulling his phone from his pocket. I'll step outside and make a few calls. I want to check with some contacts and see if anyone's heard from Thomas. He glanced at Jack, then back at me. We'll get to the bottom of this, Melanie. I nodded, watching him walk toward the door, his expression unreadable as he dialed his phone. Once he was out of sight, I exhaled, letting the exhaustion I'd been holding back wash over me. The unease I'd felt all night was turning into something else, fear. The restaurant was bustling around us, but it felt like we were sitting in a bubble, separate from the world. I glanced at my phone, half expecting a message or a call from Thomas, some explanation for all of this, but the screen was dark, silent. I looked down at Jack, his little hands moving his toy car back and forth on the table. His innocence, his complete unawareness of the storm brewing around us, made my heart ache. I had to keep it together, for him, if not for myself. Suddenly, the door to the restaurant swung open, and a woman walked in, her eyes scanning the room with an intensity that made me sit up straight. She was tall, with dark hair pulled back into a severe bun, dressed in a sharp business suit. Her gaze landed on me, and without hesitation, she started walking toward our table. My stomach clenched. I had a bad feeling about this. She stopped in front of me, her eyes cold and assessing. Melanie Dawson. I blinked, taken aback by her abruptness. Yes, who are you? I'm Rebecca Lawson, she said, her voice smooth but with an edge. Thomas's partner. Her words hung in the air like a bomb, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. I knew who she was. Of course I did. But to see her standing here, so bold, so sure of herself, it was like a slap in the face. What do you want? I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Rebecca crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing. I think you know exactly why I'm here. Thomas is missing, and I know you have something to do with it. My mouth went dry, shock and anger coursing through me. What are you talking about? I have no idea where Thomas is. I've been waiting for him just like you. She scoffed. Don't play dumb, Melanie. You might have fooled him, but you don't fool me. You've always been manipulative, playing the perfect wife while plotting behind his back. Now he's gone, and you think you can take everything from him. From me? I stared at her, stunned. I don't know where Thomas is, and I certainly don't want anything from him. The only reason I'm here is because we were supposed to meet about the divorce. Rebecca's eyes blazed with anger. You're lying. I know you found his will. He left everything to you, didn't he? And now he's conveniently disappeared. How convenient. My heart pounded in my chest. How did she know about the will? I had barely processed it myself, and yet here she was, accusing me of something I hadn't even begun to understand. Listen to me, I said, standing up, my voice trembling with barely controlled fury. I didn't do anything to Thomas. I don't know where he is, and frankly, I don't care about his money or his estate. All I want is to move on with my life, and that's exactly what I was trying to do before all of this. Rebecca's face remained stony, but something flickered in her eyes, doubt, maybe, or hesitation. She opened her mouth to say something else, but before she could, James walked back in, his expression dark and focused. Is there a problem here? He asked, stepping between us, his voice calm but firm. Rebecca glared at him, but said nothing, turning on her heel and walking away without another word. As she disappeared out the door, I collapsed into my seat, my hands trembling. James sat down across from me, his face serious. What did she want? She thinks I had something to do with Thomas's disappearance, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. She knows about the will. James cursed under his breath. This just keeps getting more complicated. I buried my face in my hands, trying to steady my breathing. What am I supposed to do, James? This is turning into a nightmare. James leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. We're going to figure this out, but you need to be prepared for the worst, Melanie. If Thomas doesn't show up soon, people are going to start asking questions, and Rebecca's accusations are just the beginning. I nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle over me. The doubts that had been gnawing at the edges of my mind were now impossible to ignore. Something was very wrong, and I was caught in the middle of it. The tension in the restaurant simmered after Rebecca's dramatic exit, but my mind refused to quiet. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, accusing, unrelenting. I tried to push the encounter from my mind, focusing on Jack and his toy car, but the stress clung to me like a second skin. James was on his phone again, speaking in hushed tones as he paced near the door. I knew he was doing everything he could, but it wasn't enough to shake the unsettling feeling that had settled deep in my gut. Mom, can we go home now? Jack's small voice pulled me out of my thoughts. I looked at him, his wide eyes tired but patient. I was about to answer when the sound of a chair scraping the floor caught my attention. I glanced over and saw a man at a nearby table clutching his throat, his face turning a deep shade of red. At first, I thought he was just coughing, but when he shot to his feet, hands gripping his neck in panic, I knew something was seriously wrong. The people at his table started shouting, and the restaurant fell into chaos. Is he choking? Someone yelled. Without thinking, I stood up, my instincts kicking in. The medical training that had been drilled into me during my years in the hospital took over, pushing everything else aside. I rushed to the man's side, quickly assessing the situation. His airway was completely blocked. There was no sound, no air coming in or out. I'm a doctor, I announced, my voice firm and steady, though my heart was racing. Give me some space. The people around us scattered, eyes wide with fear as they backed away. I turned to the man and positioned myself behind him, my arms wrapping around his middle. I was about to try the Heimlich maneuver when he collapsed, falling to his knees and then slumping forward onto the floor. Panic surged through me, but I fought to remain calm. I knelt down beside him and tilted his head back slightly, checking for any sign of breathing. There was none. His face was pale, his lips tinged with blue. "Call an ambulance," I shouted, glancing over at a waitress frozen nearby. She fumbled with her phone, her hands shaking as she dialed the number. I knew time was running out. If I didn't act now, he could die. I pulled a pen from my bag, disassembled it quickly, and pressed my fingers to his throat, searching for the exact spot. "What are you doing?" A voice cried out from behind me. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My entire focus was on the man in front of me, on the small tube I was about to create in his throat. I pressed down with the makeshift tool and punctured the skin just above the trachea. Blood welled up, but I had no choice. I inserted the hollow pen casing into the incision, praying it would give him the air he so desperately needed. For a moment, nothing happened. "Come on," I whispered, my hands trembling as I adjusted the tube. Then, to my immense relief, I heard the faintest gasp. His chest began to rise and fall, shallow but steady. He was breathing again. James rushed over just as the man's color started to return. His eyes fluttered open, dazed and confused, but alive. "Melanie," James breathed, looking at me in awe. "You saved his life." I sat back on my heels, my hands covered in blood, my heart still racing. The room around me had gone silent, the other diners staring in shock. "Is he going to be okay?" A woman, one of the man's companions, asked, her voice trembling. "I think so," I replied, though I knew he needed to get to a hospital immediately. "The ambulance is on the way. They'll take over from here." The woman burst into tears, clutching the man's hand as he lay there, still too weak to speak. James crouched beside me, his hand resting gently on my shoulder. "You were amazing," he said quietly. "I've never seen anything like that." I shook my head, still trying to process what had just happened. It's just what I do. I didn't have a choice. Jack appeared at my side, his little face pale with worry. "Mom, is he gonna be okay?" I pulled him close, my blood-stained hands trembling as I stroked his hair. "Yes, sweetheart, he's going to be fine." The sirens wailed in the distance, and I could see the flashing lights of the ambulance pulling up outside the restaurant. Paramedics rushed in, quickly taking over as they assessed the man's condition and prepared to transport him to the hospital. I stood up, my legs shaky beneath me, and stepped back as they wheeled him out on a stretcher. The woman, his friend or wife, clutched his hand all the way out the door, her sobs quieting as they disappeared into the night. The adrenaline that had kept me going was now draining fast, leaving me exhausted and on edge. My hands were still trembling and my chest felt tight. I had been in countless emergencies before, but this one felt different. Maybe it was because I hadn't been in a hospital, or maybe it was because I was already so emotionally drained from everything else. Either way, the weight of it was almost unbearable. James turned to me, his expression filled with concern. "You did everything right, Melanie. He wouldn't have made it if it weren't for you." I tried to smile, but it felt forced. "I'm just glad I was here." But even as I said it, the gnawing feeling of doubt returned. Thomas was still missing. Rebecca's accusations were still fresh in my mind. And now, this emergency had only added another layer of confusion and chaos to an already overwhelming day. I looked at James, his steady presence a small comfort in the storm. "Let's get Jack home," I said softly. "I need to process all of this." James nodded, his hand lingering on my shoulder for a moment longer. "We'll figure it out, one step at a time." As we left the restaurant, I couldn't help but glance back at the scene of the emergency, wondering what else was waiting for me around the next corner. Something told me this was just the beginning. The next few days were a blur of phone calls, legal meetings, and sleepless nights. I tried to settle into a routine for Jack's sake, but the weight of everything going on kept dragging me under. Thomas was still missing, and the discovery of his will, naming me as the sole heir to his estate, hung over me like a dark cloud. It felt wrong, and with every passing hour, my suspicions grew. James had been my anchor, helping me navigate the legal storm brewing around Thomas's disappearance. But the more we dug into the situation, the more tangled it became. I sat in his office one morning, the air thick with tension. Papers were scattered across the desk, documents I could barely make sense of, despite James's careful explanations. My mind kept drifting back to the restaurant incident, replaying it over and over again like a broken record. "So where does this leave me?" I asked, my voice strained. I tapped the will in front of me, still trying to grasp its implications. Why would Thomas leave everything to me? We were in the middle of a divorce. It just doesn't add up. James leaned forward in his chair, his brow furrowed in thought. It's unusual, yes, but it's also possible he was trying to make amends, Melanie. Maybe he felt guilty about how things ended between you two. I shook my head, my frustration bubbling over. No, this isn't Thomas. I know him. He wouldn't have done something like this without a reason. There's something else going on. I can feel it. Just as I finished speaking, James's office door burst open, and to my surprise, Rebecca stormed in. Her face was a mask of fury, her eyes locked on me like a predator about to pounce. "You," she spat, pointing a finger in my direction. "I knew you were behind this." I stood up, instinctively pulling back from her aggressive energy. "Rebecca, what are you talking about?" "Don't play dumb," she snapped, taking a step closer. "Thomas is missing, and now I hear that he left you everything in his will. How convenient for you, Melanie. How very convenient." James stood, positioning himself between us. "Rebecca, this isn't the time or the place. Melanie had nothing to do with Thomas's disappearance, and you're making wild accusations without any proof." "Proof?" Rebecca's laugh was sharp and cold. "Oh, I have proof. I know what kind of person she is. Thomas told me everything, how she was manipulative, how she always played the victim. He was going to leave her for me, and now he's gone, and she gets everything?" I swallowed hard, the accusations hitting like punches. I had no idea about the will until I found it at the restaurant, and I'm as worried about Thomas as you are. Rebecca's face twisted in disbelief. "Worried? Please, you're sitting here, in this office, planning your next move, while the love of my life is missing." I glanced at James, silently pleading for him to step in before this confrontation spiraled out of control. But he remained calm, a pillar of reason amidst the chaos. "Rebecca," James said, his tone measured but firm, "I understand you're upset, but this is not helping anyone. The police are doing their job, and we're working through the legalities of the will. If you have evidence or something to share, take it to the authorities. But accusing Melanie without facts is only going to make things worse." Rebecca's eyes flared with anger, but she seemed to realize she was getting nowhere. She turned back to me, her voice low and venomous. "I don't care what you say. I know you're hiding something. And when I find out what it is, I'll make sure you pay for it." With that, she stormed out of the office, slamming the door behind her. The room fell into an uneasy silence, the weight of her words hanging in the air. I collapsed back into my chair, feeling as though the wind had been knocked out of me. "She hates me," I whispered, more to myself than to James. "She really thinks I did something to him." James exhaled slowly, his hand resting on the edge of his desk. "She's grieving, Melanie. People say and do irrational things when they're in pain. Right now, she's looking for someone to blame." I shook my head, the knot of tension in my chest tightening. "It's more than that. There's something she's not telling us. Why else would she show up here, accusing me like that? She knows something." James didn't argue, but the thoughtful look on his face told me he was weighing my words carefully. "I'll reach out to the police and see if they have any updates on the investigation. Maybe they've uncovered something that'll shed light on this." I nodded, grateful for his steady presence. "Thank you. I need to know the truth, James. I need to know what's really going on with Thomas. And until I do, I can't shake this feeling that something terrible is about to happen. He reached across the desk, his hand covering mine in a reassuring gesture. We'll figure this out, Melanie, one way or another. But as I left his office that day, the weight of Rebecca's accusations followed me, a shadow I couldn't escape. And deep down, I knew the truth was far more complicated than any of us realized. The tension in my life had reached an unbearable peak. Every corner I turned seemed to reveal more questions, more doubts about the man I had once loved and the life I thought I understood. Thomas's disappearance had become a web of intrigue, and now Rebecca's accusations hung in the air, poisoning everything. The police had been silent for days, and my conversations with James, while helpful, left me feeling no closer to the truth. The will, Rebecca's fury, Thomas's vanishing act, nothing made sense. I was trapped in a story I couldn't control, and the more I tried to piece it together, the more the lies unraveled. I found myself standing in the quiet of my apartment, staring at the will once more. Every line seemed to taunt me. Why would Thomas name me as his heir? We were on the brink of divorce, hardly speaking except for terse emails and mediated conversations. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. My thoughts were interrupted by the sound of my phone ringing. It was James. "Melanie, I think we need to talk," he said, his voice grave. "Did the police find something?" I asked, my heart racing. "They haven't found Thomas yet, but they uncovered something else. Something about his finances. It seems there were substantial withdrawals from his account in the weeks leading up to his disappearance." "Withdrawals? For what?" I asked, feeling a chill run down my spine. "That's the problem. They're unaccounted for, and there's more. His business records show some unusual transactions with shell companies that lead back to, well, let's just say it's not looking good for Thomas. He was involved in something shady, Melanie." I swallowed hard, trying to process the news. "What does that mean for us? For Jack?" James hesitated before responding. "It means that if Thomas doesn't show up soon, his estate will be frozen for investigation. If he was involved in illegal activity, it could complicate everything, even the will." I let out a shaky breath, feeling like the ground beneath me was slipping away. Do you think Thomas knew he was in trouble? Is that why he disappeared?" "That's a possibility," James replied, "but there's still no clear sign of where he is or what happened to him. The police are looking into it, but this is turning into a much bigger investigation than any of us thought." Before I could respond, there was a knock on my door. I opened it to find Rebecca standing there, her expression unreadable. She pushed past me and entered the living room without waiting for an invitation. "Rebecca, what are you doing here?" I asked, startled by her sudden appearance. She didn't answer right away, instead pacing the room like a caged animal. Finally, she turned to me, her eyes narrowing. "I know you think I'm the enemy here, Melanie, but I'm not. We both want the same thing, answers." "I don't know what you're talking about," I said cautiously. "Thomas was hiding something from both of us," she continued, ignoring my protest. "And I think I know what it is." I crossed my arms, feeling my pulse quicken. "Go on." Rebecca pulled out a folded piece of paper from her bag, handing it to me. It was a printout of an email, one between her and Thomas. I scanned it quickly, the words blurring in front of me as the reality sank in. The email spoke of a secret account, one that Thomas had been funneling money into for months. It was an offshore account, set up to keep his assets hidden in case things went south. "I found this in his personal email," Rebecca said, her voice tense. "He was planning something, Melanie. He was going to disappear and leave us both behind." The shock hit me like a wave. "What are you saying? That Thomas faked his own disappearance?" "I don't know for sure," she admitted, "but it looks that way. He was scared of being found out. And now he's gone, and we're left with the mess." My mind raced. Could Thomas really have been planning to run away from everything? From me, from Rebecca, from Jack? It didn't seem possible, but the evidence was right in front of me. It all started to make a horrible kind of sense. I don't know what to say, I stammered, sinking onto the couch. This is too much. Rebecca sat down across from me, her anger replaced by something resembling exhaustion. I didn't want to believe it either. I thought Thomas loved me, that he was leaving you for me. But it was all a lie. He was using both of us to cover his tracks. I shook my head, trying to absorb the information. So what do we do now? We work together, Rebecca said, surprising me with the sudden shift in her tone. If we don't figure this out, we'll both be left in the cold. I've already spoken to my lawyer and he agrees. We need to find out where Thomas is, and what he's hiding. I looked at her, my anger and distrust momentarily pushed aside by the gravity of the situation. You're right, we need to know the truth, for Jack's sake if nothing else. For the first time since this ordeal began, I felt a strange alliance forming between us. Rebecca and I were caught in the same storm, both victims of Thomas's lies. As much as I hated to admit it, we needed each other to survive whatever was coming next. I'm going to call James, I said, standing up with renewed determination. We'll figure this out, together. Rebecca nodded, her eyes still hard, but with a glimmer of agreement. Let's hope we're not too late. The phone call that morning sent a chill through me. It had been days since I'd last heard anything from the police or James about Thomas's disappearance. I had come to accept the disturbing possibility that he had truly vanished, either on the run or worse, dead. But now, suddenly, everything shifted. Melanie, James's voice crackled through the line, urgent and low. Thomas has been found. My heart nearly stopped. What? Where? Is he? He's alive, but there's more to the story, James interrupted. You need to come down to the station. There's something you should see. See? What do you mean? I asked, feeling my pulse quicken. I can't explain it over the phone. Just come. I hung up, my mind racing. Rebecca had been right. Thomas had been hiding something all along. But what was it? Why would he disappear for so long and then suddenly be found? And why did James sound so serious? The knot in my stomach twisted tighter as I grabbed my coat and hurried out the door. When I arrived at the police station, James was waiting for me. His face was grim, and the sight of him did nothing to ease my anxiety. Where is he? I asked, barely able to keep the tremor from my voice. He's in custody, James said, leading me inside. But before you see him, I need to prepare you for something. I stopped in my tracks, feeling a wave of dread wash over me. Prepare me? For what? James glanced down the hallway, where two officers stood guard outside an interrogation room. He ran a hand through his hair, clearly weighing his words. Thomas didn't just disappear, Melanie. He's been living under a fake identity for weeks. When the police found him, he was in a small town upstate, posing as a completely different person. My mind reeled. What? Why? What the hell was he thinking? He was trying to disappear, James explained. The offshore accounts, the shell companies, it was all part of a plan to escape. He knew the law was closing in on him. But something went wrong. We don't know exactly what yet, but it seems like he got spooked before he could execute his plan fully. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The man I had spent years with, the father of my child, had been living a double life. The weight of the betrayal hit me hard, but before I could fully process it, James gently placed a hand on my arm. I know this is overwhelming, but there's more, he said softly. You should talk to him. Talk to him? After everything he had done? I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but somehow I found myself nodding. I had to hear it from Thomas himself. The interrogation room was small and sterile, the kind of place designed to strip you of any sense of control. Thomas sat at a metal table, handcuffed, his once confident posture slumped in defeat. His hair was longer, his face thinner, but it was unmistakably him. As soon as our eyes met, a flood of emotions surged through me, anger, confusion, hurt. But above all, I needed answers. Thomas, I said, my voice tight as I sat across from him. What the hell happened? Why did you do this? He looked up at me, his eyes hollow and tired. Melanie, I didn't have a choice. You didn't have a choice, I repeated, incredulous. You didn't have a choice but to fake your own disappearance and leave your family behind. I was in too deep, he said, his voice cracking slightly. You wouldn't understand. Try me, I snapped, my patience wearing thin. I think I deserve an explanation. Thomas sighed, leaning back in his chair as if the weight of his lies had finally caught up to him. I messed up, Melanie. I got involved with the wrong people. The business, it wasn't what it seemed. I made some bad deals, tried to fix things, but it all started falling apart. The offshore accounts, the shell companies, they were my way out. I was going to disappear, take the money, and start over. And leave me and Jack behind. I asked, my voice trembling with disbelief. You were going to walk away from everything, from us? He lowered his gaze, unable to meet my eyes. I didn't want to drag you down with me. I thought, if I was gone, you'd be better off. I could hardly believe what I was hearing. You thought disappearing without a trace would somehow make things better? Do you have any idea what you put us through? The police thought you were dead. Jack thought his father had abandoned him. I didn't plan for it to go like this, Thomas said quietly. Things got out of control. I was trying to protect you. Protect me, I echoed bitterly. You weren't protecting anyone but yourself. The room fell silent, the air thick with tension. I stared at Thomas, the man who had once been my whole world, now a stranger sitting across from me. His lies, his cowardice, it was all too much. I had come here seeking answers, but instead I found nothing but emptiness. I don't know what to say, I whispered, my voice breaking. I thought I knew you, but I was wrong. Thomas finally looked up, his eyes filled with a strange mixture of regret and defeat. I'm sorry, Melanie, I really am. I never wanted it to end like this. I stood up, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on me. It already ended, Thomas, a long time ago. As I turned to leave, he called out one last time. For what it's worth, I did love you, I still do. I paused for a moment, letting his words hang in the air, but they meant nothing to me now. Without another word, I walked out of the room, leaving Thomas and everything he had done behind. It had been 3 weeks since I walked out of that interrogation room, leaving Thomas and his web of lies behind. Life had felt heavy for a long time, but something about that day had broken me open in a way I didn't expect. The closure I had been searching for wasn't in Thomas's words, or even in the answers I had sought from him. It was in the act of letting go. Today, I stood in front of a large window at James' office, looking out at the city below. The divorce was final. The papers sat on James's desk, freshly signed. I had gained full custody of Jack, and Thomas was facing a series of criminal charges that would keep him in custody for a long time. Are you ready to put this behind you? James asked gently, stepping into the room. I turned to face him, offering a small smile. I think I'm getting there. It's been a lot to process, but I'm starting to feel lighter. James nodded, his dark eyes warm with understanding. He had been my rock through all of this, always steady, always there when I needed a voice of reason or a calm presence to lean on. Well, now that the papers are signed, you can finally move forward. You and Jack deserve that. I exhaled deeply, as though I had been holding my breath for months. I didn't think I'd feel this way. It's strange, but part of me thought I'd be more broken by all of it. You're stronger than you give yourself credit for, James said, stepping closer. You've handled more in these last few months than most people deal with in a lifetime. And through it all, you've kept your head up. I gave a small laugh, shaking my head. I don't know about that. There were plenty of nights I just cried myself to sleep, wondering what I'd done wrong. James' expression softened. You didn't do anything wrong, Melanie. Thomas made his choices, and you shouldn't carry the weight of his mistakes. The room fell silent for a moment as I let his words sink in. He was right, of course. For too long, I had blamed myself for everything, for Thomas's deception, for the collapse of our marriage, even for his disappearance. But I was starting to see that none of it had been my fault. I glanced at the papers on the desk. The finality of it all. I expected to feel sorrow, but all I felt was relief. I think this is the first time in a long time that I feel free, I said quietly. It's terrifying, but it's also exciting. James smiled warmly, that familiar steadiness in his gaze. You deserve a fresh start. You deserve to be happy. Later that afternoon, I picked up Jack from school. His face lit up when he saw me, and I couldn't help but smile back. My son had been through so much, but he had handled everything with a resilience that amazed me every day. Hey, buddy, I said as he ran up to me. How was your day? It was good, he chirped, hopping into the car. We learned about dinosaurs. Did you know the T-Rex had tiny arms but really strong legs? I laughed, buckling him into his seat. That's right. I think you'd make a pretty good dinosaur expert one day. Jack grinned, his eyes twinkling with excitement. Maybe I will. As I drove us home, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. The city buzzed around us, but for the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't consumed by the chaos. I was simply present, in the moment with Jack, in this new chapter of our lives. When we got home, I made dinner while Jack played with his toys in the living room. The warmth of the kitchen, the sound of him laughing as he built his Lego tower, it all felt so normal. I had longed for this kind of normalcy. As I finished setting the table, there was a knock at the door. My heart skipped a beat. It had been a long time since we had visitors. Wiping my hands on a towel, I walked over and opened the door to find James standing on the porch, holding a bouquet of flowers. I know you said you were cooking tonight, but I couldn't resist, he said with a smile, handing me the bouquet. I raised an eyebrow, suppressing a grin. James, you didn't have to do that. I know, he said, his tone playful yet sincere. But I wanted to. Jack came running to the door, his face lighting up when he saw James. Hi, James. Want to play with my Legos? James laughed, crouching down to Jack's level. I'd love to, but I think your mom might need help setting the table first. Deal? Jack nodded enthusiastically before running back to his toys. I stepped aside, letting James in. You really didn't have to do this, I said softly, but I couldn't hide the warmth in my voice. I wanted to, he repeated, his gaze lingering on mine. You deserve something beautiful after everything you've been through. I looked down at the flowers, my chest tightening with a mix of emotions. It had been so long since someone had done something like this for me, something thoughtful, something kind. Thank you, James, I whispered, meeting his eyes again, for everything. He smiled, that gentle, reassuring smile that had become so familiar. You don't have to thank me, Melanie. I'm just glad I could be here. As we sat down for dinner, a feeling of warmth and comfort settled over the room. For the first time in years, I wasn't haunted by the weight of my past. The future was uncertain, yes, but it was mine to shape now. After dinner, Jack fell asleep on the couch, exhausted from his day of dinosaur facts and Lego building. James and I sat together in the quiet of the living room, sipping tea as the city lights flickered outside the window. What's next for you? James asked softly, breaking the comfortable silence. I leaned back, thinking about the question. I don't know, I admitted. But for the first time, I'm okay with not knowing. I think I just want to take things one day at a time, focus on Jack, and figure out what makes me happy. James nodded thoughtfully. That sounds like a good plan. I smiled, feeling a sense of calm that I hadn't felt in a long time. Yeah, I think it's a start. As the night wore on, I realized that while my life had taken so many unexpected turns, I was finally heading in the right direction. There was no more uncertainty about Thomas, no more doubt hanging over my head. There was only this new beginning, this quiet, hopeful moment. For the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I was ready to embrace whatever came next.